Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Karen Umamoto, the Helen and Morgan Chu Chair and Director of the Asian American Studies Center. And I'd like to start by acknowledging and honoring the Tongva peoples as the traditional caretakers of Tovangar, which is the Los Angeles Basin and the South Channel Islands, the lands upon which we live. Today's seminar or webinar is sponsored by the UCLA Asian American Studies Center, the UCLA Institute on Inequality and Democracy, the UCLA Center for Neighborhood Knowledge, K-Town for All, Unión de Vecinos, and the Chinatown Community for Equitable Development. With a rule that has prevented rent evictions set to be lifted as early as August 14th, about 365,000 renter households in Los Angeles County are in imminent danger of eviction and homelessness, according to a recent study from the UCLA Luskin Institute on Inequality and Democracy. Today's forum with housing justice researchers and community organizations will focus on the tenants' rights crisis and what can be done to mitigate the damage to Angelenos through enforceable rights, robust protections, and new ways of thinking about tackling the problem. I would like to start by introducing our 6 speakers today. We start by introducing Gary Blasi. He's Professor Emeritus of Law with the UCLA School of Law. Ananya Roy is the Director of the UCLA Luskin Institute on Inequality and Democracy and a Professor of Urban Planning, Social Welfare, and Geography. Paul Ong is a research professor and director with the UCLA Center for Neighborhood Knowledge. And Leonardo Vilches and Elizabeth Blaney are the co-directors and co-founders of Unión de Vecinos and co-founders of the citywide LA Tenants Union. Jane Lee is a co-founder and co-organizer with K-Town for All. And our last 2 speakers, Jason Lee and Alejandro Gutierrez Cortez, are members of Chinatown Community for Equitable Development. So just before we start, a few housekeeping details before we begin. First, we'll be recording this session for online viewing following the program. The researchers will discuss their reports for 10 minutes each, and the community speakers will briefly talk about their organization's work, and any remaining time will be devoted to questions and answers. And please send your Q&A, use a Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen that to send us questions. It's a packed agenda and there will be more questions than we can entertain. So we encourage you to read the reports and reach out to these organizations. We'll send those links out to you, all of you who registered following the program. So let's begin. It's really an honor to introduce Gary Blasi, Emeritus Professor with the UCLA Law School. He will present the highlights of his study called UD Day, Impending Evictions and Homelessness in Los Angeles. And UD stands for Unlawful Detainer, which Gary can explain more about. So thank you very much, Gary, for sharing this report with us today.
Thank you, Karen. And if we can start with the slides. We now know as of Friday that UD Day is likely to be August 14th, unless there is some extraordinary intervention by the governor or the legislature. You might wonder why that is, because we've had various moratoria passed in various settings in the county, the city, various cities, but the only real moratorium on evictions has been that imposed by the Judicial Council, which is the administrative arm of the courts. Emergency Rule 1 prohibited any court in the state from issuing a summons on an unlawful detainer case. Unlawful detainer cases is the legal name for an eviction proceeding in California. The Judicial Council originally had scheduled for that date to be earlier on August 3rd, but before the vote could be completed, the Chief Justice, who chairs the Judicial Council put a stop to the vote or halted the vote, and in order to give the courts and the legislature some time to prepare. The Judicial Council is voting even today on whether to lift that rule. So that's why 18 days from now, unless something happens that hasn't been announced yet, evictions will resume. The reason the other moratoria will not have much effect, there are a few reasons. One is that they typically require tenants to have knowledge of a complicated rule, and in many cases they require notice to the landlord, meeting certain requirements, and even record keeping of certain kinds of documents. They require unrepresented tenants to prove the cause of their failure to be able to pay rent is related to COVID-19. And overall, most tenants never get a chance to put on a defense because they're unable to file an answer to the complaint that's served against them within 5 business days. And those who do go to trial lose 95% of the time. So generally speaking, unlawful detainers without lawyers end in eviction. Next slide, please. The UD Day report that I'm discussing was an effort to estimate the scale of that problem. Based on unemployment insurance applications through May 9, and next slide, please. I estimated that there were 365,000 households that in Los Angeles County had no employment income and no other income, and therefore were highly likely to be unable to pay the rent and likely to face eviction. So that's the at-risk households. Of those who do get evicted, one can only estimate how many of them will actually become homeless. The optimistic assumption that we made in the study was that 10% of them will become homeless because 90% of them may have social network support or other means of avoiding homelessness. And typically about 10% of people who become homeless remain homeless for some period of time. Those networks, however, have also been severely degraded by the pandemic. Since that report was issued, looking at the most recent available data, or most recently available to me through June 20, those numbers have gone up. So using the same methodology today would result in about, we need the next slide, please. Would result in around 495,000 households with 758,000 children. I suspect that number is high given some of the other estimates and information that have become available, but it's a very large number. And if you were to cut it in half, that would still be 25,000 households and 37,000 children roughly. Other estimates have been published since I published and we published that original estimate. One of them comes in at 650,000 households in LA County, if you attribute LA County's share of rental households in the state. And an Aspen Institute affiliate estimates about 1.2 million people, not households, in LA County, again, as a proportion of those in California that they estimate. Next slide, please. The third slide, please. Okay, so the question is what can be done to stop this or to slow it down at least? First of all, and again, can I have the third slide up? Right. So your governor, your state senator, your assembly person can act to stop it. And there are a number of things that they can do, some of which are probably going to be realized and some of which are real long shots. They could cancel the rent, as many are demanding in the movement for renters' rights. Or they could impose payback limits or time periods to make payments, and which would be less legally controversial. The one place in the legislature that there seems to be some action as late as today is SB 1410, which would have the state pay landlords back rent essentially with tax credits, and under an agreement that the landlord would accept those tax credits for future income or against future income in lieu of rent from the tenant. That would essentially prevent, provided that the landlord and the tenant agreed, that would prevent the evictions. That does have support from both the more progressive members of the legislature and also the California Apartment Association. So that has some possibilities, and hopefully that will soften the blow considerably. If they can't stop it, at least we can slow the spread and give tenants a chance to assert their rights. As I say, the likelihood that an unrepresented tenant will be able to stay in their home, even if they have good legal defenses, are very small. And there are efforts to ramp up the number of lawyers that are available to help tenants, but those efforts pale in comparison to what the possible need could be. There are also some efforts to help tenants be able to at least file an answer to the complaint themselves so that they won't face eviction within just a few weeks. That will give them some time possibly to either find housing or work out an agreement or to get a lawyer to help assert their rights. The alternative, the last alternative, is really to prepare for the worst, which working with the Institute on Inequality and Democracy, we have done, I have done. We've prepared 2 reports that you can find on the Luskin IID website. One is called Hotel California, that looks at how government can not only lease but acquire for use as interim housing, and in some cases with conversion longer-term housing, some of the 70,000 hotel and motel rooms throughout the county that are currently empty, even though we have thousands of people on the street now. The second and most recent report is called For the Crisis Yet to Come. It speaks about temporary settlements, which in this case means the use of small structures that are available for about $7,000 a piece and are manufactured by people who have been homeless and people in need. As another option, what's really not an option is ignoring the situation. I think we should all anticipate some significant reaction, particularly as the racially disparate impact of all this comes to be clear, and as we see armed sheriffs operating as law enforcement officers, removing families from their homes and putting them on the streets. I don't think we can expect no reaction to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary, for all the great work on the research and for sharing this report with us. It's an honor to introduce our next speaker, who is Professor Ananya Roy. She's the director of the UCLA Luskin Institute on Inequality and Democracy, and a professor in the Urban Planning Department, as well as Geography and Social Work. She's also a member of our Asian American Studies Center Faculty Advisory Committee, and will talk about her report entitled Hotel California, Housing the Crisis. Thank you, Ananya.
Karen and colleagues for organizing this important panel. So as director of the UCLA Luskin Institute on Inequality and Democracy, I'm going to share some of the work we have been doing in collaboration with Professor Gary Blasi, from whom you just heard, as well as movement-based scholars to think about housing justice in the time of COVID-19. Next slide, please. So I want to reiterate what Professor Blasi has already presented. And I put these numbers up again on our screen because I think it's important for us to keep in mind the sheer scale and scope of the displacement that is to come in Los Angeles. In our shared collaborative work, we have been talking about this as possibly the largest mass displacement in the history of the Los Angeles region since indigenous genocide and dispossession. We see this as the systematic unhousing of people, and therefore part of the long history of the forced removals of people of color in Los Angeles as well as in other US cities. And we also see this as the failure at all levels of government to act. None of this is inevitable. And in particular, we have to think about how many of the programs that are being currently touted as rent relief do not, in fact, center rent-burdened tenants. They protect landlords from market risk, and they convert rent into debt. So this is the background against which we did our second report that Gary's already mentioned. Next slide, please. Hotel California Housing the Crisis, which Gary and I had the opportunity to work on with two amazing movement-based scholars, Johnny Coleman, who organizes with No Olympics LA, and Ilana Eden, who organizes with the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, as well as with the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project. Next slide, please. Our argument in this report was that mass displacement requires the mass expansion of housing. And we are not at all convinced that the existing models of housing provision, be it the provision of so-called affordable housing, be it specific mechanisms like Prop HHH, or the recovery plans that are now being put forward by public agencies such as LASA or the governor's Project Home Key framework, we're not at all convinced that these recovery plans or existing models of housing provision will in fact be able to deliver on the mass expansion of housing that is urgently needed. So the LASA COVID-19 recovery plan, it really puts forward the idea of spending $800 million to temporarily house 15,000 of the most vulnerable people in Los Angeles County experiencing homelessness. This will simply not do. This will be a squandering of public resources and the continued failure to house people. Next slide. Our starting point in the report, though, is one experiment in housing the unhoused, Project Roomkey, that is both a state-level program and a county-level program, and that utilizes vacant tourist hotel and motel rooms to provide emergency non-congregate sheltering to the unhoused. There are many problems with Project Roomkey, and those problems are manifested in, next slide please, what has been the excruciatingly slow progress to house people. So as many have commented, Los Angeles has flattened the wrong curve. Project Roomkey has plateaued, and there's been a complete slowdown in this effort to house the unhoused at a time of great vulnerability. Next slide, please. Our argument is that in order to move past this kind of plateauing, a different approach is needed to tourist hotels and motels. And an important starting point is to recognize that Los Angeles as a city has already spent vast public resources in subsidizing luxury tourist hotels and the convention centers associated with them. Housing justice movements have repeatedly brought to public attention the fact that almost $1 billion in subsidies have been given to hotels in just a short span of time, and that those subsidies continue. Those hotel rooms lie vacant, and yet could have been used to house the 70,000 people experiencing homelessness in Los Angeles at the moment. Next slide. One important aspect of Project Room Key that we also carry through in our report is that during the time of emergency, especially a public health emergency, as our present moment, government executives in California, including mayors, have the legal authority to commandeer private property, as long as that there is fair compensation after such use of property. But government executives in California, whether it be the governor or whether it be Mayor Garcetti, have not used these commandeering authorities in order to provide housing. And yet going forward, as we think about the utilization of vacant tourist hotels and motels for housing, such commandeering in the time of emergency, for the use of public purpose tools such as eminent domain in the post-emergency period will be absolutely essential in order to ensure that mass expansion of housing. And here, of course, we take inspiration from the housing justice movements that have already been making the argument for the use of eminent domain, be it in the ongoing struggle at Hillside Villas, or be it the case with reclaiming homes in El Sereno. The El Sereno case shows us how eminent domain was used to unhouse people and how vacant houses are being held by public agencies like Caltrans. And this is the time to use such housing for tenants who face evictions as well as for the unhoused. Next slide. An important piece of all of this for us is perhaps a slightly different approach to housing, that so much of the homeless services industrial complex has come to focus on an elaborate infrastructure of services that are appropriate for the chronically homeless, but not necessarily appropriate or even needed for those who are facing first-time homelessness. So we return to the housing first model that was put forward by Dr. Sam Simbaris, and we remind policymakers that this model was about immediate access to housing without conditions and without the policing of those who are being housed. Next slide. And this is a really important point for us as Los Angeles continues to see an increase in first-time homelessness, and in particular sees the growing role of economic hardship and weakened social networks as causes of that first-time homelessness. These numbers are from the greater Los Angeles homeless count prior to COVID-19. We can only imagine that this is going to get much worse. Next slide. So I want to close with the idea of key principles that must undergird the mass expansion of housing, and that for us really is a vision of social housing, of the expansion of permanent housing that is social housing that centers community control and tenant power. Next slide. So I want to close on the note that this also means that we have to think about the communities that are most vulnerable to this crisis. We have a sense already of who these communities are, the Black and brown neighborhoods that have been subject to a long history of racialized exploitation. Next slide. And as Professor Paul Ong and his research associates have shown, that vulnerability is only going to deepen with the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide. So the work needs to happen at the scale of the city and county, and also needs to focus on at-risk zip codes. If we are to think about a just recovery, we have to think about how this moment of crisis will possibly become a new moment of wealth loss for these communities and a new moment of racialized, predatory financial speculation in these neighborhoods. Final slide, next slide, please. So I want to close on the note then that as we hear narratives of austerity at a moment of recovery, it is important for us to keep in mind that the resources are there, including in the form of relief funds from the federal government. The question is how these resources are to be used. So we are at an extraordinary moment of national uprising for Black lives and racial justice. Part of that movement is the call to defund police and abolish systems of policing. As the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project reminds us, it is very possible to find the resources if we invest in racial justice rather than in racial oppression. And to do this, though, we have to think about housing justice, not just as a set of technocratic ideas, but as the movements in LA have shown, as an uprising. What most is on my mind is a statement that Leonardo Vilches, from whom you'll hear later today, reminds us often of. We cannot participate in negotiating our defeat. This is the time to make practical, radical, and just ideas of housing. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Ananya. And to help us kind of dig deeper into this idea of the rental crisis and systemic inequality, we have as our next speaker, Professor Paul Ong, who's the director of the Center for Neighborhood Knowledge, a research professor with the Urban Planning Department, and a longtime faculty who has played leading roles at the Asian American Studies Center. So thank you and welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you for this most important webinar. What we try to do at CNK is empirically document what people already know. That is, the economy in our institution seems to be amplifying inequalities that already existed before the pandemic. Next slide, please. These are sort of just rough estimates of the number of renters who were unable to pay rent in May and June. We're talking about 750,000 in California. Yeah, that's well over 2.5 million persons and 800,000 children. Regardless of which numbers you use, they are massive. And what we're saying is that it is systemic. It is interlocking with other forms and other factors that existed before the crisis, and again, being amplified during the crisis. We're talking about inequalities that are being produced in the past and today and into the future. The systemic inequality produces systematic inequality. And for us, two important dimensions of that is along class and along race lines. Next slide, please. And so you could get a sense of the crisis, the rental crisis. On the left side, the graph shows the percentage during the week of the survey that were unable to pay their rent. And it fluctuates. It fluctuates with the economy and the pandemic. And at times when stores reopen, more people are able to pay, but there's still massive numbers of people who are behind in their rents. We also see on the right one, the link to the labor market in terms of whether a respondent had a job or not. If you don't have a job, you're less likely to pay. And if you had lost earnings since March, you're less likely able to pay. Clearly, these are things that people know. And what we're trying to do is give a sense of the magnitude in terms of the statistics. Next slide, please. And there are systematic racial and class differences in terms of the proportion of renters who are unable to pay their rent. And you could see the racial gaps on the left side. On the right side are the income gaps, gaps along class lines as measured by annual income in 2019. Next slide, please. And we also see differences in terms of education. Education is human capital. It is one that empowers you. It is also one that connects you to resources and so forth. And differences in educational attainment makes a huge difference whether or not you're able to collect pay your rent or not. These things don't operate independently. For example, educational level and household incomes are very connected to each other in terms of race. And you can see that on the right-hand side. The vertical scale is income in log scale. On the bottom scale, the X scale, is average years of education. And there you could see both the systematic differences in income as well as education, but also the link between the two. Next slide, please. And so we're beginning to understand the factors that are creating the disparities across racial and class lines. It also gets played out in terms of neighborhoods. And the neighborhoods most at risk for those who know Los Angeles are in the central area, the highly urbanized areas, the areas where low-income people and people of color reside. Next slide, please. And I just want to close this off, again, going back to the idea of systemic inequality. And what we mean by systemic inequality is this link across different arenas, across different dimensions. In the previous slide, I showed you vulnerability in terms of rent, in terms of potential evictions in the future. This is our index of shelter-in-place burden. This is a composite that is, if you live in overcrowded neighborhoods, if you live in overcrowded apartments, if you live in a neighborhood with very few open spaces, if you live in a neighborhood that doesn't have a supermarket within walking distance, if you're not able to get around, if you're not connected through transportation and the internet, then the burden of sheltering in place is much higher. And again, what you see, particularly in the central part of Los Angeles, is that's where the greatest burdens are. And those burdens are systematic along racial and class line. Next slide, please. These are some of the other reports that we have done looking at the different dimensions in terms of employment, in terms of housing, in terms of exposure, in terms of lack of financial access. We're grateful to our partners who helped us in getting this information out, as well as supporting the research. As a whole, what this points to us is that we need to think about this as really systemic inequality. And in thinking about it in that direction, we need to think about how do we approach it, and it ought to be in a comprehensive way. What that means is that the problem is not isolated in one arena, and nor should our solutions be isolated in one arena. We need to think about sort of much more structural changes, institutional changes that will move us to a much more just society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you to all of our researchers and presenters for these reports that you've worked hard on and the insightful suggestions that you've made. And these presentations really make us think about what we know about the current problem and what we might do to advocate, organize, and support those who might be impacted. And we have some amazing community organizers joining us today who are working with tenants to organize and advocate for rent and other protections to avoid the third disaster of mass evictions, as well as longer-term solutions to homelessness. And we're going to start with Elizabeth Blaney, assisted by Leonardo Vilches, who will handle more the Q&A section from what I understand. They are the co-directors and co-founders of Unión de Vecinos and the co-founders of the citywide LA Tenants Union. And their experiences has helped put Unión de Vecinos, the East Side local of the Los Angeles Tenants Union, in a leadership role against gentrification in Boyle Heights. They are also the 20-year activists in residence with the UCLA Institute of Inequality and Democracy. So thank you very much, Leonardo and Elizabeth, for sharing your important work with us.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting us to be here today. So, Unión de Vecinos, we are located in Boyle Heights, East LA, have been doing this work since 1996. Basically, we do a lot of neighborhood work on multi-issues, but one issue that's been in common across the board, of course, is housing. We have been working with others from other parts of Los Angeles, and in 2015 is then when we started the LA Tenants Union across the entire city. We have 15 chapters throughout Los Angeles, and then we've also helped found tenant unions in Glendale and Long Beach and Inglewood and Pasadena. And so really this tenant movement is something that is really growing and growing quickly. A couple of the things that I wanted to talk about today is the rent strike. There's a national rent strike, as many of you know, and we are part of an autonomous tenant union network that is working on that collectively. And in April of 2020 is when we launched the rent strike. People don't have the rent to pay, don't have the money to pay, and have been organizing in their buildings, in their chapters, in their neighborhoods for rent cancellation. So that is the demand of the strike. I think one of the things that we have really seen as the strike goes on, and as there has been really no relief for tenants during this process, I mean, there's been some protections with what the judicial court has done and giving us now, you know, this defense when the courts open back up to start surveying evictions, but that's really not enough. Some of the rent relief programs, which we all know are ridiculous, they had 150,000 applicants on day one for 50,000 opportunities when the city opened up their rent relief fund. And we've seen that these rent relief funds are very exclusionary, discriminatory, they are not meant for everyone, they are not accessible to everyone, and they are not the solution. Rent cancellation is the solution. As we have gone on longer with the strike, of course, tenants are getting more desperate, are feeling more concerned, more stressed. We have seen some self-evictions just because people are feeling this burden of this debt, of this accumulation of debt. So we have been doing a lot of political education outreach around what is debt and what kind of debt is rent debt, and how is rent debt different than the other kind of debt that we may have, and who's responsible for this debt. There's so much shame and guilt that people carry around the debt, and so really raising the question of, this is not our fault. It's not as if we went out and bought a plasma TV and decided, oh, I'm not going to pay my credit card for it. No, this wasn't our fault. The government shut down our businesses, and the government prevented us from working. So we shouldn't feel this guilt around the debt. We shouldn't carry that. And actually having this debt is a sense of power. It is a power for us to be able to negotiate. It is a power for us to be able to improve our housing conditions. So I think it's really important for tenants who may be listening to this to understand that this debt is not our fault. And we shouldn't take it in that way, and we shouldn't feel ashamed of it. We should see it as power to be able to gain back control over our housing situation. And we need to pay for food. We need to pay for medicine. Those are the priorities that we need to have. And the government needs to cancel the debt across the board. And when we look at this question of forgiveness, I mean, what are we seeing happen with the PPP program? How many corporations got millions of dollars forgiven, and yet there's this hesitancy by the state and the feds to cancel debt for us, but they had no problem canceling it for corporations. And if you go to the SBA website, you can see the list of all of the corporations that got that, and you'll be able to see that some of the same landlords who are harassing and threatening us are the same ones who got their debt canceled. They applied for the loans, a lot of those corporate landlords, and then they got their debt forgiven. And yet they're still coming to tenants and pressuring tenants to try and get them out and collect money. And that has to stop. And the only way to do that is doing rent cancellation across the board. And we are going to continue to fight to do that. one of the questions and one of the other slides from the presenters is about what can be done. Well, that's what we're doing, organizing. We're organizing building by building, block by block. We really encourage tenants, for any tenants who are on this phone, talk to your neighbors. If you have not talked to a neighbor in your building, go out after this webinar and go talk to them. Talk to them about the situation, get together in a meeting, figure out how you're going to work collectively, because one day, if they haven't already, the landlord is going to come and put pressure on you and try and collect any rent that you haven't paid, and you need to be working together. Don't accept any type of meeting that is one-on-one. You need to meet together, none of this divide and conquer. So one tenant's going to get a special deal and another tenant's going to get a special deal. Everybody loses when that happens. So organize in your buildings and organize in your chapters, and really having that conversation. We find that a lot of tenants don't know their neighbors until crisis happens. And beyond the hi and goodbye type of politeness, this is the time to really get out there and talk to your neighbors. The other thing that we have seen in the South Central local, I want to give out a shout out to them, as well as East Hollywood, some amazing work that some of our chapters have done around illegal evictions and illegal lockouts. Landlords have gotten desperate because they haven't been able to use the courts right now. And so they have just gone in and changed the locks, thrown people's stuff out on the street. And the tenants, because they are organized, because they are connected to a network, call the other members of the chapters, and tenants show up and they reclaim that space. And even though police may be there, they tell the police, you can't do anything about it. You don't have a court order. We are going to go back and take that home and reclaim that space, and they are doing it. And we will continue to do that. We will continue to occupy our homes even when the evictions happen. We're not going to stay. So I think my time is up. So again, thank you for all of you, and you can go to our website, latenantunion.org, to get connected.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Leonardo, I know that we were going to wait for you to speak in the Q&A, but do you want to say a few words now as well?
Just briefly, and then I'll address this during the question and answer the questions. But I mean, we just need to see this on the dark side of what Gary is presenting. We need to prepare for the worst, and for all of us who are on the side of justice, who are on the side of tenants, we need to prepare for a big fight. A fight that is going to be presented in the courts, that is going to be presented in the streets, and is going to be presented politically. The credibility of our government officials is gone. When Eric Garcetti stands in front of the Twitter, on TV, or everybody, and tells, please wear your mask, and ignores the poverty and the displacement and the refugee crisis that is coming because of this failure of the state, he is not doing his work. When Uri Martinez complains about the fact that the federal government is not doing anything for us, she has failed in her role as leadership. And when the council members are attacking each other for corruption and talking about themselves as the cleanest people, and they have done nothing to address the homeless crisis or to fight against gentrification, they haven't done their job. We are in a position where we're going to have to fight, and we need to start preparing for that situation.
Okay. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Jane Wen, and she's an organizer and co-founder of K-Town for All. And she's active with the Services Not Sweeps Coalition, and as a founding member, serves on the board of Invisible People. And we were privileged to have Jane as our activist in residence at the UCLA Asian American Studies Center. So thank you, Jane.
Hi, thank you for having me. The previous presenters have laid out the horrors of living in Los Angeles, with the stark statistics of nearly 500,000 households at risk of eviction in the coming months. And so to live in LA is to be horrified daily of the sheer deprivation and the failures, the abject failure of our local government. So K-Town for All was founded about 2 years ago in response to protests against the homeless shelter in Koreatown. At that time, we didn't know what we were doing. We were, none of us had any experience with homelessness, and we weren't organizers or activists. And we joined Korean Resource Center, KRC, and Kiwa, Koreatown Immigrant Workers Alliance, in support of this homeless shelter, because we saw this as the least that the city can be doing. And then we started talking to our unhoused neighbors. So next slide. For 2 years, we've been visiting our unhoused neighbors every week. We provide supplies, wet wipes, water, snacks, resources. And as we talked to our unhoused neighbors, we realized that in this neighborhood with hundreds of people experiencing homelessness, there was no bathroom for people to go to. People don't have access to drinking water, no shower, and really no place where people felt like they can even rest. And in addition to the abject neglect of our city government, what they would also do is sweep people away. The city has long had a policy of criminalizing homelessness and erasing the visible signs of poverty rather than lifting people out of poverty and trying to connect people to housing. So we formed a coalition called Services Not Sweeps. Next slide. With other organizations, including CCED, LA CAN, Street Watch LA under DSA LA, CLAW. And so our response to these sweeps is that instead of sweeping people away, instead of sending a team of sanitation workers with hazmat suits and police officers, what the city should be doing is providing people with basic health and hygiene services. People need bathrooms, they need regular garbage pickup, showers, needle exchanges. And so we worked with the city, we really tried. A coalition of us were in regular talks and they ignored us. We were just asking for these very minimal things. We believe that every encampment should have bathrooms, hand washing stations. And so instead of doing any of these things, the city had to rush to implement these hand washing stations and porta potties at the onset of COVID-19. And at the beginning of COVID-19, there was really no quick response to these immediate health needs. And it was up to us to make these makeshift hand washing stations. And now in the summer, as it's getting hot, we find that it's up to us to create these DIY cooling. We make it out of like these foam coolers with a fan and ice because there are no cooling centers for people. And as people are dying on the streets, there are at least 3 unhoused people who die on the streets every day. There are at least 70,000 to 100,000 hotel rooms that are sitting empty. Next slide. And from Services Not Sweeps, we organized to form a statewide coalition called No Vacancy California. And Professor Ananya Roy has explained it, laid it out so much more brilliantly than I could. So please check out the report, Hotel California. And we were calling on Mayor Garcetti to commandeer hotel rooms because it's well within his authority to do so. But as we've seen time and time again, our city leaders fail to meet the urgency of the moment. So Mayor Garcetti could easily seize these hotel rooms and house every single person experiencing homelessness right now. But instead, we are seeing that they would rather divert our resources to the police. Next slide. And we joined the People's Budget LA coalition led by Black Lives Matter LA to reimagine a better Los Angeles. This was convened just a couple months ago, and we really had no idea that this would be part of a nationwide movement. If you look at the budget, the city is allocating $3 billion to LAPD and only a tiny sliver, $400 million to homelessness services. So mathematically, it's impossible to even solve homelessness. And it's clear from looking at the Mayor Garcetti's budget is that he really has no serious intention to solve homelessness. The response has always been to criminalize homelessness and to sweep it away. So the People's Budget LA has laid out a framework for how we can actually address the urgent needs that we're facing. Instead of spending money on bullets, tear gas, handcuffs, and helicopters, and the bloated salaries of police officers, we could be spending our money on things like transportation, trees, clean air and water. We could have clean streets and sidewalks, jobs. We can house everyone. We can cancel rent. And so all of this amazing organizing led by Black Lives Matter LA has led to the unthinkable, which is the partial defunding of the police, $150 million. And so, as always, the answer to homelessness is not criminalization. Next slide. So let's talk about sex, special enforcement, and cleanup zones, which is something that City Council will be voting on Wednesday. And so we'll really be seeing if they truly live up to their words of reimagining public safety. This will be seen as a litmus test as to whether or not they are truly capable of living up to this moment of nationwide unrest. I encourage you to call your council member, tell them to vote against criminalization of poverty and against the criminalization of homelessness, and go to homesnotzones.com to get involved in our campaign. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. Another organization right on the front lines, along with Unión de Vecinos and K-Town for All, is a Chinatown community for equitable development. And we're honored today to have Justin Lee and Alejandro Gutierrez Cortez from the organization to share with us what they're doing as well. So thank you, Jason and Alejandro.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So first up, I'd like to thank Unión de Vecinos and K-Town for All for sharing. Definitely, there have been so many inactions by the city, as well as terrible violence inflicted by the Ponce communities. CCED, we are a grassroots organization in Los Angeles, Chinatown. And what we have been doing over the past 7 or so years is, first off, to advocate for ethical development in the community. We recognize that gentrification is rapidly occurring everywhere. And what community needs is definitely not market rate luxury housing, definitely not businesses that aren't catered towards the community that they're trying to enter. One of the things that we try to do is to organize with tenants, help organize tenant associations to fight bad landlords. These are often corporations who are trying to buy their way into communities and then evict tenants that they can rake in more profits by bringing in richer, wealthier tenants. So one of the things that we try to do to empower tenants is to educate them, as well as provide resources in order for them to fight for themselves and take actions for their families, friends, and neighbors. All of this to ensure that they have the agency to shape the community as they see fit. One of the things that we've been doing recently is mutual aid work, where we're providing supplies to things like masks and sanitizers. These are necessities that are difficult for residents of Chinatown to access right now. One of the main reasons is that there isn't any full service markets around anymore. The last one was removed, kicked out last December. There's very few resources that tenants can access. And obviously, the responsibility to address these issues should fall on elected officials. Yes, there have been things like the Angelenos part and then subsidies, but these are things that aren't easily accessible towards the community. Barring the fact that there's so many limited spots for each of those, the information for each of these assistance programs, it wasn't given in the proper way, proper channels to community residents. Not mentioning the language barriers, just information in general, that wasn't received by the community. The community had to take on labor that was the responsibility of the government. And that's an issue in itself. But another reason why there's some difficulties for community survival is obviously rent. On average, residents pay more than 30% of their income on the rent alone. And now that there's little to no income left because of the pandemic, from jobs being lost, a lot of the remaining sources of money they have gone. There's a need to cancel rent. There's a need to cancel rent because there are necessities that people need, but they cannot afford to do so because they have to pay rent. And if they're not able to pay rent, as we all know, there are evictions coming. There will be an increase in homelessness. And there's a certain type of balance in this, in that city officials are not doing anything strong enough to prevent this. The current eviction moratorium doesn't really stop anything. Tenants will suffer eviction. They will suffer harassment. And I want to talk about some of the buildings that we organize with. One building we organize with is 920 Everett Tenant Association. It's a small 6-unit building, and it's full of Southeast Asian families who have deep roots in the community, sometimes lived up to 15 years in that building alone. And there hasn't been a lot of protection for them. Over the past year or so, they've had to constantly fight off eviction. And even now, they're facing eviction from VX development. And we've had to come up with creative means in order to address upcoming evictions and threats by the landlord. Additionally, another building we've been working with is Hillside Villa. It's 124 families. So we try to treat all buildings with full attention. And it's because every single affordable housing, every single building matters to us. The affordable housing stock is depleting, and we need to fight to keep community members in homes. We need to increase affordable housing for people to live in. Now, for Hillside Villa specifically, again, it's a 124 family building. It's one of few developments that are still multi-family. It's also multi-level income, where you have market rate units, low income units, and Section 8 housing. It was built under a community redevelopment agency, and it was affordable for 30 years, allowed low income folks to live there. So a few years ago, the status began to expire, and folks were given 100% rent increase. Thankfully, they got off, but now they've been served a 200% rent increase due in October. And it's essentially an eviction to many of the tenants there, another reason for eminent domain. And if Alejandro is here, could you share about your experiences with as a tenant in Hillside Villa?
Yes. Well, first of all, like Jason said, the covenant expired, the 3 years covenant expired on 2018, and the landlord expected us to pay the market rate starting on September last year, 2019. But since we got the help and orientation from Los Angeles Tenant Union and CCD, we started organizing. We found out that the landlord didn't do all the process in a legal way, so we were about to go to court to fight it, but then he dropped it and he started the process again. So now by October this year, we are in the same situation than last year. That he wants to raise our rent even more than last year. Last year, like in my case, for the 2-bedroom apartment, he wanted 1,950, but this year he wants 2,450. So right now I'm paying $1,063 compared to what he wants us to pay. So basically he wants to evict us. So that's an that's an eviction, actually. So none of my neighbors is going to be able to pay that. So that's why we are fighting for the eminent domain. First of all, because we would like to set a precedent. We would like to be the first building in LA that gets the eminent domain to keep families in their homes. And it is, I think you guys know, Gil Cedillo is helping us on this process, but we need to push them because we need to be on top of them. You know, politicians, they take their time, but we don't have that time. So we've been pushing and pushing in order for them to enforce the eminent domain because they agree, or Gil Cedillo office agree, that it's cheaper to enforce eminent domain than to build a new building. So it's for them it's cheaper. They're going to spend less money than if they build a new building, and it takes more time. And plus, we are families who've been there for 15, 20, 30 years. All our basic things are in that neighborhood: our doctor's appointments, our jobs, the families who have their kids in local schools. So if we cannot get the eminent domain and the building starts charging the rent for market rate, none of us could afford it. So it would be a massive displacement because of that.
Thank you for sharing, Alejandro. I want to add one ironic fact about this building is that a lot of the families living in Hillside Villa were displaced by eminent domain at the convention center roughly 30 years.
Yes, there were families who were relocated from or displaced from the convention center area at the time they were, that project came over there, so they were relocated to the Hillside Villa. So now, 30 years later, some of these families are facing the same, these families are facing the same situation to get displaced.
Yeah, so again, we want to push the city to take back the building for public good. And again, we can't rely on city council to pass strong protections or to do anything for the community unless we add the pressure onto them. And yeah, that's about all we have to share for now.
Okay. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Alejandro. And thank you to all the speakers. I think it's very, very clear from hearing all of the speakers that the situation is dire and the need for action is urgent. There are many different ideas that have been proposed here and elsewhere, and many of you who are watching this Zoom webinar are very active yourselves in trying to find ways to tackle the problem. A lot of people think that rent cancellation, debt cancellation, eminent domain, using hotels and motels for immediate housing are ideas that are a little out there. But this problem that we face is unprecedented, and we need to really think out of the box and feel comfortable thinking out of the box. And I think I really appreciate both the scholars, researchers, and community organizers for really crafting thoughtfully alternatives that we have right before us and showing their feasibility as well and their immediate impact in addressing the issue. So I'd like to open it up for some questions that we've received in the question and answer box that I'd like to just begin with. And the first question is for Leonardo and Elizabeth. And they ask, an anonymous participant asks, can any of you share more about the cancel rent? How would those work, and who needs to act upon those to make them an option? And if you could unmute before you speak, thank you.
Well, the cancel rent and the rent strike is pretty much a response to the notion of the moratorium. During the moratorium, there was this whole idea that people were not going to get evicted for not paying rent, and tenants were not clear on what that meant to them in terms of the legal part of it, but also under the notion of debt. You know, this is an imposed debt. People lost their jobs. People's hours were cut because of a badly organized healthcare system. It's not really COVID, it's the healthcare system under capitalism that has been the fund that creates the crisis. So this debt was imposed on the community, and within the tenants union, there was a lot of debate of whether people should pay the rent or not, or what were the risks that they were having. So when we were talking to the tenants, obviously the tenants were confronting the contradiction between having to pay for food and basic needs and emergency needs and the rent. So that's where we launched the idea of food, not rent. In the long run, we believe that, like the debt collective, that when we own our debt, we own the problem. When we add the number of the amount of money that is owed by the tenants in Los Angeles, it's a very, very powerful amount of money. And this is money that could be spent on the street, that could create new jobs, and that could create an alternative economy. So it's very important for tenants to take control of that debt and to use the power that they have during this negotiation process to determine the terms of their tenancy. We're still demanding for the city to, well, and another thing that I think is ridiculous, this whole notion that you have to define that what rent is due because of COVID and what rent is not due because of COVID. The whole crisis of COVID is attacking everybody from all angles. So we continue to ask the tenants, to encourage the tenants not to pay the rent. We think that that amount of money, if is redirected somewhere or can be used as a tool for negotiation, and we think that we need to move forward and push to change the terms of tenancy. We cannot live in this city anymore, accepting that the city council and the mayor hate the poor, and that they're willing to live in a city where there is no poor people living in it.
Thank you. Elizabeth, did you want to add to that?
No, I'm good. I want to make sure we can have time for other questions.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. The next question is, housing justice activists have been critical of Nuri Martinez's $100 million plus handout to landlords for a multitude of reasons. One reason being that it was a poor use of finances that did not go towards implementing permanent social housing or real tenant protections. This participant wants to know, how is SB 1410 any different? Would it not increase economic inequality and be abused by landlords, hampering tenants in the process? And I don't know, could any of you who feel equipped to answer this question, please do.
You want to go for it? I mean, at this moment, we have to take what the government is giving us. Like, they gave us the moratorium, they're giving us 1436. I mean, at the end of the day, that's not what we want ideally. And that's why I think it's very important to distinguish the policy questions from the political questions. And I think in moments like this, while we have to pay attention to policy, respond to policy, implement policy, and push forward policy, we really need to think politically. We're in a city and a state that has become Democrat. And again, it's like the time when Obama was elected. You know, we had the American dream had become a reality. Or in the state of California, we're in a state where everybody's a Democrat, yet this political system is not responding to the needs of the most poor. So, of course, we want to have some kind of moratorium and extension on the payments of the things, but ideally, this debt has to be forgiven, has to be forgone, has to be forgotten. And it's up to us, the tenants, the vendors, the BIPOC people, to organize and to demand that those conditions occur. That's not going to be negotiated by the non-profits. That's not going to be negotiated by the policymakers. That's us fighting to change those conditions.
One thing to add to that is this is also voluntary. There's nothing that's really, it's voluntary for landlords to participate in. And so for it to have any benefit, again, is putting the power in the hands of the landlords is to decide whether or not they want to do this. And that is a huge problem.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question for Professor Ananya Roy, Jason Lee, and Alejandro. And it is, do you believe that lawmakers view the use of eminent domain for housing expansion as a political risk that is greater than the risk of continuing to pursue projects such as Project Room Key and Project Home Key? If so, how quickly can that political calculation be shifted in favor of approaches such as the use of eminent domain?
Jason and Alejandro, why don't you go first?
Sure. Personally, I would say lawmakers do perceive it as a greater political risk, use eminent domain, particularly because it would set a precedent that would allow other buildings within the city to be bought by the city as well. And in terms of how quickly we can raise support for tools such as eminent domain, I want to say that depends on how much pressure that we can place on the city council and officials that make these decisions. Is there anything you'd like to add, Alejandro?
Well, not much, because I mean this is something new here in LA. We were told different things, but I'm not sure if it is true. But like I said, this is something new. We know it takes time to complete the process. So, yeah.
Thank you. And Ananya, do you want to go?
Yes, I'll just add to that and go back to the point that Leonardo also made. I think this is about political demands, and this, as you noted, Karen, an unprecedented moment. So in our Hotel California report, we, inspired by the struggle at Hillside Villa, as well as other struggles, make the argument that the time has come to flip the script of eminent domain, that these are public purpose tools that have been used to underwrite upscale development, quite a bit of which has caused displacement. And we need to think about housing as a public purpose. So, but that kind of policy framework, right, the seizing, if you will, of the 70,000 vacant tourist hotel and motel rooms can only happen when action, mass mobilization of the likes that we are now seeing in LA makes this then a political necessity. I think the challenge is that our city council remains beholden to property interests. And this is the case at all levels of government, and therefore the so-called relief programs that we're seeing protect landlords from market risk. They continue. I'm pretty sure, I can guarantee that we will see recovery plans that will use the logics of eminent domain and redevelopment and other things, but to underwrite upscale development, some of it under the sign of Olympics 2028. So it's really a matter of seizing the master's tools and putting them to the public purposes that they should be used for.
Thank you. Leonardo?
Well, no, just real quick. In addition, also building infrastructure that puts that pressure. So I'm thinking in terms of a city that was built, the large immigrant population that was built here under the sanctuary movement within the Underground Railroad and the whole history of the United States. I think we need to build within the city the Underground Railroad movement that starts occupying those spaces, that starts occupying those hotels little by little, and think about what is the structure that we need to build as organizations, as a movement, to not just to wait for eminent domain to be implemented, but to start occupying each one of those spaces.
Thank you. We have a question for Professor Blasi that reads, earlier you said that extraordinary intervention by the governor or legislature is needed, yet so much of the focus and advocacy for action remains local. How can we push and help advocate at the state level to expedite action? And I know that you might also have things to say about questions that involved AB 1436 and SB 1410. So feel free to speak to that as well.
Sure. So let me clarify that the emergency powers of the mayor as the chief executive of the city, the chair of the board of supervisors as the chief executive of the county, and the governor are extraordinary. They themselves could stop all evictions. If you imagine that they can seize property without any notice, in fact, as long as they pay for it later, they can stop evictions. Now, the landlords will say that their property has been taken and therefore that has to be paid to them. But that would be far cheaper than dealing with the consequences of putting thousands and thousands of families on the street and then trying to get them back into housing. So the kinds of things that are pending in the legislature or really just in the legislature at this point would, as Leonardo says, provide the relief that's being offered. But the relief that could come is complete, and it's just a question of the political will to do that. 1436, AB 1436, which seems to have stalled in the Senate Judiciary Committee, would again soften the blow. It would postpone basically UD Day for a year. But in a year, people are not going to have the money to pay the rent any more than they have it now. They probably have less rent, less ability to do that. So it's not really an option. It would give some time for both organizers and community groups to build power, and it would give some time for tenants to develop some additional capacity to assert what rights they do have in the legal system, and for all of us to fight the illegal evictions, both legally and through direct action. So I think the whole spectrum of things have to be considered, but we shouldn't take anything off the table, including demanding that that the mayor, the board of supervisors, and the governor freeze evictions if the judicial council won't.
Gary, this is kind of a piggyback on that. There seems to be a lot of concern about this August 14th deadline. What does that mean? What will happen after August 14th, and what do people need to be prepared for?
So on August 14th, landlords that have been preparing complaints for evictions, their lawyers have been preparing them, they can file electronically. They can file thousands and thousands of eviction cases on that day. And if that day remains available, I expect they will. There will be a rush to the head of the line so that the earlier case numbers will be heard first. Unfortunately, the local Superior Court has basically refused to make information about evictions widely available. So there may be some struggle with just our local court system to find out how many cases are filed. But the day was picked by the Chief Justice because she was told by the legislature that with the legislature back in session starting today, they would come up with something by the 18th. So she's not expecting, I think, this to go on without some measure to stop it. But so far, those measures, as has been pointed out, are sort of half measures that require landlord agreement and have a lot of other conditions attached to them.
And one more follow-up. Will there be any legal recourse available to tenants for fighting those eviction orders?
Well, it's very difficult for tenants to fight evictions without legal counsel. The first step is you have to file an answer. And a group of people at the Debt Collective with a public interest software development team, if you will, are working to try to make it easier for tenants to file answers. And whether that can be done by August 18th is an open question. But we think it's important that tenants often have legal defenses, and they lose either because they're not able to file an answer or because they have to go to court without a lawyer. And in front of a judge, they always lose. In front of a jury, they might have a better chance.
I have a question from one of our alumni. And this might be for Ananya, but others are free to chime in. why are we talking about using shelters and hotel rooms to deal with mass evictions? Why not keep people who are currently housed in their homes? And wouldn't it be more efficient to spend money on paying for their rent or rent subsidies rather than move them into hotels?
I greatly appreciate that question because it allows me to clarify. None of us who wrote the Hotel California report would advocate for this use of public resources. The report, as Gary Blasi noted in his presentation, was written anticipating the failure at all levels of government to keep people in their homes. So in addition to that, we already have nearly 70,000 unhoused neighbors living in encampments and on the streets in Los Angeles. 72% are unsheltered, and given COVID-19, existing congregate shelters are an unsafe environment for our unhoused neighbors. So that is one reason to advocate for the acquisition of vacant tourist hotels and motels. We anticipate that 70,000 of these rooms and many of these hotels and motels will not return to business as usual for 4 to 5 years. But on the question of mass evictions, of course, we should do everything to keep people in their homes. And many of us have argued, including in recent media interviews, that it is the correct thing to do. It is also the economically efficient thing to do to keep people in their homes. But given that we fear that this is not going to happen, that UD Day is here, we have also, as researchers, felt it incumbent upon us to think about what a just recovery might entail, part of which is this idea of using hotels and motels. And this is why in the report we make the argument that this is not about emergency shelter. We know from research in other parts of the world and from previous history here that folks will be in those hotel and motel rooms for a few years. And it is also therefore necessary to think about this as decent housing, to think about tenant rights, to think about this as a form of tenancy and not simply as places of relief.
Thank you. We have exactly 7 minutes left, and I want to just give everybody 30 seconds just to make a final closing comment. So Ananya, do you want to start? I'm just going to go in the order that I'm seeing you.
I said a lot already. I just want to give a shout out to the movements that have been doing this work for a long time, but as Jane has noted, have come together in various coalitions. And this coalition between housing justice movements and racial justice movements gives me tremendous optimism. So this is a moment of deep crisis, but it's also a moment of deep potential for structural change.
Thank you. Leonardo, can you unmute?
Yes. Well, yeah, I think, I mean, from the perspective of the Tenants Union, the first line of defense for us is people have to struggle and to fight to stay at home. Everybody, everywhere. I mean, this is the fight against gentrification, it's against displacement. And we need to organize wherever we are for everybody to stay at home. We need to eliminate this whole notion of vacant hotels, and we need to fill them up with all the people who are unhoused. And we need to fight the false promise of development. Basically, what we're talking about in terms of the hotels, in terms of the Olympics, in terms of all these processes, is this false promise that with development, with investment, our communities are going to change. Our history tells us otherwise. Every time that these promises are brought to our communities, people are being pushed out. After the COVID crisis, or as the COVID crisis changes, that promise is going to come back, and it's going to create a city where the poor don't live in it. So we need to fight back, need to stay at home. And we need to understand that this is a moment for politics, not a moment for policies. Policies are helpful, but at this moment, we really need to think in terms of the politics.
Thank you. Gary.
I could only add and try to amplify what Leonardo just said. I've been a lawyer for 45 years. I've done a lot of policy advocacy. Everything that's going to happen from now on is going to be determined in the streets and in the politics at the grassroots level, which is the only thing politicians at this point are going to listen to when the other voices have so much money attached to them. So I've stopped giving money to nonprofits and only give money the people who yell at politicians as opposed to people who lobby them.
Thank you. Jason and Alejandro?
I first want to appreciate what Leonardo has said. A lot of the activities we do that involve pressuring politicians, as well as fighting for legal tools like eminent domain. Ultimately, these are just tools, one of the few options that we have, but we do need to organize as a community, whether it be on the streets or at home. We need to be in this fight together to ensure that everyone can stay home without the fear of eviction or eviction. Would you like to share anything, Alejandro?
Yeah, definitely. I agree that we have to motivate people to organize, to fight for affordable housing, for a place that we can afford to pay, that we don't have to choose between food or another necessities or pay rent. And we could fight any way that we could or is in our hands, or like in our case in Hillside Villa, the only choice we see to fight is enforce eminent domain. Mostly eminent domain, when it's enforced, is to displace families, to bring projects to the community, or like freeways or some other kind of project that's supposed to benefit the communities. But this time we want to we want the government to enforce eminent domain to keep families in their homes, not to displace them.
Thank you. Paul?
Thank you. I would encourage people to both concentrate on the housing sector, but look upstream. Look at the failure of the labor market, the failure of our worker protection and unemployment insurance program. It is from that people are unable to pay because they can't earn enough, or they do not have enough in terms of workers' benefits. I would encourage us to think sideways too. Look at the failure of the safety network. Look at the failure of the ability to have adequate food. This forces people to make choices between feeding one's family, paying the rent, or covering other necessities. And I would also encourage us to look downstream in terms of not only the repercussion in terms of homelessness and displacement. I think we're moving into a recovery that's going to restructure the urban landscape. We need to think downstream about how we're going to restructure it. So it's fantastic, all the work that's being done in the housing sector, but it is a systemic problem, as people are talking about now, which means we think systemically. We think about the economy, we think about the labor market, we think about the tattered safety network, we think about all the pressures that's going to restructure our society and our economy. And we have to be part of that also.
Thank you. Jane?
So it's clear that things are bleak right now, to put it lightly. And in our desperation, we're yelling at politicians. We are begging them to do the right thing. And we do this out of love. We are fighting for love and housing. And I just want to say that one of the most profound and powerful things that I've witnessed as an organizer for only 2 years is witnessing change happening in real time. So from now until UD Day, we have a huge opportunity to really challenge political power. And I just want to say that we're one of the richest cities in the world. There's no excuse that we can't house everyone.
Thank you. Elizabeth?
Yes, I agree with Paul. This is a systemic problem, but I see that there is so much opportunity given COVID to redefine and dismantle systems that we know that were not working before COVID and are crashing and failing during COVID. So this is an opportunity for us to completely rebuild and reestablish systems that will work for us and that will work for the working poor, for those who don't have housing. And we need to take that as an opportunity right now and start building that. We're already kind of starting to see that in a lot of local networks with mutual aid systems that are developed, how healthcare on some of the local levels and some of our own tenant buildings are being managed. And that's what we need to do, is implement the types of systems that we've always wanted to see and use that as an opportunity now to do it.
Thank you very much. I just want to close by saying, you know, we're all in this together. None of us are untouched by this pandemic, and none of us will be untouched by the mass evictions that are to come if we don't take action. I really want to thank all of the speakers, including the faculty and organizers on the front lines for all the work that you're doing. And to all of you who joined, took the time today to join us, and who are doing so much work yourselves. We're forever grateful, and we look forward to continuing this conversation. For all of you who have registered, we'll send you the links to the reports as well as website information for the organizations featured today. If those of you who may not have registered but would like that information, please feel free to contact our Asian American Studies Center as well, and we'll get you that information. So please be safe, everybody. We hope to see you again as we struggle together moving forward. So thank you all again.